Well, welcome to this issue of Discovering Truth at the New Movies. Hi, my name is David Lance. Today, in this episode of the Chronicles of Belteshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar arrives back in Babylon along with his captives from several various countries. Now, among the exiles are Jews, Ashkelonites, Moabites, and Ammonites. And they all hate each other. But all these groups especially hate the Jews because they are related to the Jewish enemy called the Philistines. And so, using a movie called Gran Torino with Clint Eastwood, I'll ask the question: how do we deal with gang warfare spawned by racial hatred that affects our young people? And so the Chronicles of Belteshazzar is similar to the movie The Princess Bride. In this book, it's intended for use in ages approximately 4th through 9th grade. That's kids about 9 to 15 years of age. And just like in the movie The Princess Bride, where grandpa reads a story to a sick grandson. In this story, a group of boys come over to spend the weekend with Grandpa, who tells them the story of the Chronicles of Belteshazzar. And so I want to ask you to consider joining me each episode as I read the chapter and provide commentary. I'll read one chapter at a time, and I'll include a question for reflection. I'll also provide episodes on my podcast, Discovering Truth at the Movies, and I'll provide some insights into the writing of the book and other things that relate to each chapter. And finally, you can go to a website that I've set up to sign up to get more information as I move forward. Well, let's go ahead and begin chapter 6 of the Chronicles of Belteshazzar as the Jews go into exile. So King Nebuchadnezzar has returned, Haman said to an empty balcony as he watched the army approach the gates of Babylon. As the chief priest in the court of Nebuchadnezzar and now Nebuchadnezzar, Haman yielded immense power. He controlled all the temple estates, as well as the revenues generated by the sale of goods produced on them. Haman also collected the taxes levied on all those goods and kept a percentage of the levies before passing them on to the civil authorities. As chief priest, Haman was responsible for the spiritual well-being of the kingdom, while the king was responsible for protecting the land and expanding the reach of the kingdom. But now Haman wanted absolute power, and he had devised a plan to attain it. Haman's chambers lay in the temple of Esgaliah, the building which is the foundation of heaven and earth. Haman's chambers were near the top of the temple, which had a commanding view of the terrain as far as the eye could see. Descending to the ground level of the edifice, he climbed into a carriage that awaited to take him to the city gates, where he would greet Nebuchadnezzar. Haman had prepared a banquet to honor the king. Some of the finest Hebrew ewes would be on display for Nebuchadnezzar's review. Crowds were now gathering on either side of the road leading to the Ishtar gate, where Nebuchadnezzar would enter. Haman's carriage began to traverse the bridge of the heavens, which spanned the Euphrates River. Long ago, the architects of Babylon had conceived of a city wholly self-contained and impervious to attack. They had built the city around a stretch of the Euphrates River, which flowed underneath the walls of the south and north ends of the city. If anyone ever attempted to lay siege to her, inhabitants would be ensured a source of fresh water as well as fresh fish to eat. The inner two walls of the city were 20 feet high and separated by a space of 24 feet. This space was filled with compacted dirt upon which a road had been constructed so that two chariots could ride side by side around the city. 9 city gates, named after the gods of the Babylonians, guarded the entrances to the city. These gates opened out onto bridges that spanned a canal which circled the city. A quarter league from the wall, a similar outer wall circled the city. If any invaders were to breach the outer wall, they would be demoralized by facing an even more daunting assault against the ramparts of the inner wall. It was truly a city conceived by the gods themselves. Haman's carriage came to the mouth of the Ishtar gate. The dragons and bowls engraved on the gate's surface seemingly came alive as the sunlight reflected off the glazed finish of the edifice. Already, the drawbridge was being lowered to span the 50-foot moat that surrounded the wall. Nebuchadnezzar, along with Naaman's palace guard and their captives, drew near. Haman mounted the platform that had been prepared and gave the signal for the trumpets to sound. Along the walls of the city, more citizens had appeared to greet their king. Hail Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, servant of Marduk. Your people salute you. And hail Naaman, captain of the palace guard. Haman raised his arms as he greeted Nebuchadnezzar, and seated on his throne, the sun and moon looked down over his shoulders and were unfurled. Nebuchadnezzar rode in waving to his people. Behind him came the exiles that were being brought into the city. They had been marching for the last 2 months, ever since they had left with the Hebrews from Jerusalem. But there were many other exile groups: Philistines from Ashkelon, Edomites from Petra. All the various peoples which Nebuchadnezzar was bringing to Babylon held an ancient and abiding hatred for one another. More specifically, these people hated the Hebrews. Haman smiled inwardly as he thought about them and their fanatical religion. What fools! The Hebrews were an arrogant people who alone among the nations claimed that there was only one God, their God. They would tolerate no other. It was because of their intolerance and claim that they among all the people of the earth served the one and only true God that they were held in a contempt by the rest of the world. Haman was counting on that hatred to kindle a fire that would consume Nebuchadnezzar. When it did, he would step in to fill the void. He would magnanimously allow the exiles to return to their homes. He would then inherit the empire that Nebuchadnezzar was building and have allies in the different kingdoms, controlled by Babylon loyal to him. Wait a minute, Grandpa! Mouth wide open, Grandpa stopped talking and looked down at Matthew. He's been trying to get your attention for the last minute, Grandpa, said a clearly exasperated Nai to her husband. Take a break and let Matthew ask his question. Sorry, Matthew. What is your question? Asked a sheepish Grandpa as he took off his fake beard and mustache. Grandpa, I never heard of all these other people, these Edomites and Ashkelonites and Moabites, all those ites. Who were they? Were they friends of Daniel's people? Great question, Matthew. Here, let me explain with the use of this map. Grandpa pulled out a yardstick to point and walked over to a map. Now, began Grandpa, Jerusalem was here in what was called the country of Judah. Ever since the time of Moses, there were different groups of people who hated the Jews because they, after they left Egypt, they came to the land of Canaan, the land God gave them. And when they got there, they fought many battles with the tribes who lived there. Those tribes were all the ites that I've been talking about. And for over 1,000 years, they stayed mad and they looked for a way to get revenge. As Grandpa pointed to different places, Ammon, Moab, and Edom, he told them in the history of how the nations came to be and why they didn't like the Jews. Pointing to a city near the coast of the Mediterranean Sea called Ashkelon, Grandpa said, Ashkelon was one of the last cities of the Philistines. They worshipped a god by the name of Dagon. The people of Ashkelon would do terrible things in the worship of their god. And this was another reason why the Jews and these different tribes hated each other. Matthew was still determined to get his questions answered. Grandpa, if these people didn't like the Jews and Babylon was taking some of their people and bringing them to live in Babylon just like Daniel and his people, wouldn't they cause problems? Well, what kind of problems do you mean, Matthew? Asked Isaac. Well, some of the kids from school all came to America from a different country. They speak different language. The teachers work really hard to have everyone get along, but sometimes there are fights in the restrooms. And so I figure that sort of thing happens at my school now. And then maybe if it happened at my school, then it happened back in the time of Daniel too. Excellent question, Matthew. What do you think about that, Grandpa? Asked Nine with one of her sternest grandmotherly looks. Well, I have to go to the bathroom, announced Josiah matter of factly as he got up and left the room. At that point, everyone stopped talking for a few seconds while Josiah left the room, and then everyone broke out laughing. Matthew, said Grandpa after catching his breath, you raise a very good question. You're right. The same sort of hatred and fighting would probably have happened between the different exile groups in Babylon. Tell you what, let's all take a short break and use the bathroom and refresh ourselves, and then I'll resume the story. I promise to tell you something that answers the very thing that you're asking about, Matthew. Deal? Matthew nodded his head. Deal, Grandpa. Well, let me share a personal reflection at this point regarding the story. You know, over the years, I've thought a great deal about what happens when people from different cultures, different races, maybe even different religions suddenly get tossed together and have to live together. I remember back in middle school when I was a kid, I lived in an area where there were lots of RV manufacturing in Elkhart County in the northern part of Indiana. It's kind of known as the RV capital of the country. They also make a lot of mobile homes there. Well, more and more people from Mexico started coming to where I lived in order to get jobs in the RV industry. This led to clashes between rival groups of teenagers from the white community and the Hispanic community when I was growing up. Now, if you've ever seen the play West Side Story, you get the picture. Today, it might be other racial groups. In the movie of Gran Torino, Clint Eastwood plays a Korean War veteran who can't stand Asian people. And there's a group called the Hmong who are moving in to what was formerly an all-white neighborhood where Clint Eastwood lives. Now, you can imagine the kinds of racial hatred that can erupt from that kind of situation. It doesn't make it right that those things happen, but it's the sort of thing that does happen. And most likely, it happened to Daniel and the other Jews living in Babylon as they had to live right next to the Ammonites, the Ashkelonites, and the Moabites that they had fought for centuries. So in the movie Gran Torino, Matt Kowalski, played by Clint Eastwood, is a Korean war veteran, and he can't stand the Asians. And yet, the neighborhood he's lived in all his life now has a group of Asians called the Hmong moving in. He can't stand them, but they have their own issues, and some in their community want to create gangs and ensnare young teenagers to join their criminal causes. Old Walt, that's the character that Clint Eastwood plays, is caught in the middle as a well-meaning Hmong teenager named Thang tries to steal his car as part of an initiation rite gone bad. And so I want you to pay attention to the interaction that happens between Walt and Thang's older cousin, Sue Lore. Walt Kowalski says, I don't care about him, pointing to Thao. Sue says, you hang out with him, you teach him to fix things, you saved him from that messed up cousin of ours. Sue goes on to say, and you're a better man to him than our own father was. You're a good man, Walt. Well, that leads to a question for reflection that I think is so pertinent for our day and age. And that is, how do we help our kids get along with people from different races and not get sucked into gang warfare that sometimes erupts and leads to all sorts of violence and even sometimes killings? Well, that's it for this particular episode of Discovering Truth at the Movies using the Chronicles of Belteshazzar. You can sign up to get that by going to my website at wisejargon.com/@the-movies. And when you do, you'll get Conversations with the Culture. That's my monthly newsletter, and information on gaining access to anthologies of past issues, as well as other things. Well, until next time, thanks so much, and God bless.